I'd like to point out that we are so pleased that this event is co-sponsored with the European Studies program here at Hofstra, as well as sponsorship from the European Union through the Erasmus Plus Jean Monnet module grant that was awarded to Hofstra last year. I'd also like to thank a few people that have been instrumental to this conference. And first of all, Hofstra President Susan Poser and our Provost Charles Riordan, who have been so supportive of these kinds of academic endeavors. The Interim Dean of the Hofstra College of Arts and Science, Daniel Siebold. And I'd also like to thank the Cultural Center, Kathleen Collins, Carol Mallison, Janine Rinaldi, and Amy Trotta for all of their all their effort and time that they put into this beautiful event. And a really big, special, and warm thank you to my colleague and my friend Mina Bose, who is, I don't know how she does it. I don't know when she sleeps, but she's amazing and put all this together, and it's been really a beautiful and interesting event so far, and looking forward to the rest of the conference. I also want to thank my esteemed colleagues, Associate Conference Director Richard Himmelfarb, as well as the Research Conference Director, Professor Paul Fritz. So I would like to introduce our panelists, and we are so fortunate to have highly accomplished individuals in their respective fields. I'm going to shorten their bios so that we have more time to hear them, because you really don't want to hear me. So I would like to start with Benjamin Rhodes. He is a writer, political commentator, and national security analyst. He is currently a contributor for NBC News and MSNBC, co-host of Pod Save the World, a senior advisor to former President Barack Obama, and chair of National Security Action, which he co-founded. From 2009 to 2017, Ben served as a deputy national security advisor to President Obama. He is the author of the New York Times bestseller, After the Fall, Being American in the World We've Made, and The World as It Is, a memoir of the Obama White House. His work has also been published in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and Foreign Affairs. Ben consults for the Obama Foundation, and I should also point out that you are a native New Yorker, so yes. welcome home.
Thank you.
Next, we have Peter Baker. He is the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, responsible for reporting on President Biden, and this is the 5th president that he has covered. Mr. Baker is the author of 7 books, most recently, The Divider, Trump in the White House, 2017 to 2021, written with his wife, Susan Glasser. He is the author of Obama, The Call of History. Mr. Baker has won all 3 major awards devoted to the White House reporting, the Gerald Ford Prize for Distinguished Coverage of the Presidency twice, the Aldo Beckman Memorial Award, also he won twice, and the Merriman Smith Memorial Award. Mr. Baker is also a political analyst for MSNBC and a regular panelist on PBS's Washington Week. Next, I have Laurie Buonanno. She is professor at SUNY Buffalo State University in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration. She is also director of the Institute for European Union Studies at the State University of New York. Professor Buonanno is a coordinator for an Erasmus Plus Jean Monnet module on the European Union and African Union relations at Buffalo State University. She has published about governance in the European Union, European policies, migration policy, identity, and federalism, including public administration. She is the co-author of Policies and Policy Processes of the European Union in its 2nd edition, co-editor of the New and Changing Transatlanticism, and co-editor of the Routledge Handbook of European Public Policy. And next we have Michelle Egan, who is professor and Jean Monnet Chair ad personam in the School of International Service at American University. She is the author of Single Markets, Economic Integration in Europe and the United States, and Constructing a European Market, Standards, Regulation, and Governance, as well as the editor of 3 edited volumes. Professor Egan is a global scholar at the Wilson Center and has received fellowships from the Wilson Center, the Council on Foreign Relations, Bosch Foundation, German Marshall Fund, Howard Foundation, and the European University Institute for her research activities. She is a member of Transworld, a multi-institution project on transatlantic relations and global governance. Professor Egan is also co-director of the Transatlantic Policy Center, a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. Now, as we think about EU-US or European-US relations during the time period of Obama, I think we have to look at it through the perspective of Obama's predecessor, George W. Bush, who had very mixed relations with Europe, and especially over the war in Iraq. When Obama entered the White House, European leaders were hoping for greater multilateralism and closer relations between the United States and Europe. During the Obama administration, there are several noteworthy events and policies that shaped transatlantic relations between the United States and Europe. And so during this panel, I hope to, maybe we'll get to cover some of them, not all of them, but at least some of them, and explore a little bit deeper. So the first topic that I'd like to begin with was something called the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which is called TTIP for short. And it was an attempt to create a free trade area between the United States and the European Union. And on February 13th, 2013, the United States and the European Union announced that they would launch negotiations to formulate TTIP. Although TTIP never came to fruition, my question for all of you, because there was a lot of writing and discussion, particularly in European studies circles, about TTIP and what does this mean, even though it didn't come to fruition, how did TTIP negotiations shape or reshape transatlantic relations? And what came out of the rounds of negotiations, although a final agreement was never signed? And one other question to add in, how did TTIP's failure change US-European Union relations? So I don't know who would like to start with that question.
I mean, I'll start by just giving some context, and then, first of all, I think an important piece of the TTIP story and the broader Europe story is that the most intensive diplomacy and engagement we had with European leaders throughout the entire Obama administration was actually on economic issues. And so what you have is, in 2009, you have the coordinated efforts to try to get out of the financial crisis, which included, by the way, some real differences with Europe on whether growth-based approaches or austerity approaches were the right way to do that. But then also in 2010, 2011, 2012, the US was basically like a de facto member of the European Commission in trying to manage the Eurozone crisis, because we saw as an existential threat to the global economy, if the Eurozone crisis spiraled out of control, it could have precipitated another global recession. And so we're spending all this time and effort to tailor, to help the Germans and others build stabilization packages for Greece, and it's all just preventing worse outcomes from happening. And so I think part of what TTIP was an effort to try to develop a more affirmative approach kind of coming out of this, right? We've weathered this crisis, we've fought all these fires, and we need an affirmative vision for a deeper economic and trade relationship between the United States and Europe that addresses also the changes in the nature of our economies as they become more rooted in certain technologies and service sectors. It's also the case that we were doing the Trans-Pacific Partnership in Asia, which was much more evolved, and there was some grumpiness, frankly, in Europe about this. You're rebalanced Asia at our expense, you're pivoting to Asia away from us. And our point was, no, we'd actually, first of all, we'd love for you to pivot with us, but we're still not there. But that we want to do the same thing with you and kind of create frameworks for trade that again, address the changes in our economies. It was always a bit of a long shot. I think part of the thought process was the process of resolving some issues that you do in the course of a trade negotiation could, in its own right, have benefits and could identify irritants and ways to resolve them. Obviously, I think what changed is this was already difficult from a negotiating perspective. When Trump comes in, the consensus in this country for free trade agreements generally just collapses. And so that's the end of TTIP and TPP, which was actually completed. But I do think that the issues in those negotiations continue to be the issues that are either trade irritants or areas of potential collaboration between the United States and Europe. And what I still believe needs to happen is greater alignment in our approaches, particularly on areas related to technology and supply chains. So those conversations that were part of TTIP, they're just branded differently, but they're still happening.
I guess I would add, sorry, not a trade expert. Everybody on this panel probably knows a whole lot more about it than I do. I would echo a little bit of what Ben said, because the collapse of TTIP and TPP is the fundamental shift in this country's view toward internationalism and international economics, right? It's not just because of Trump, although he gives voice to it and moves the Republican Party away from its historic fidelity to this, and therefore maybe gives room to the Democrats, who were always kind of ambivalent about it, to say, hey, yeah, that's right, forget this stuff anyway. Because not like Joe Biden has come in and said, hey, let's get back into TPP, right? And he hasn't said, hey, let's restart the negotiations on TTIP. In fact, he's the first president since Jimmy Carter to not be pursuing any major free trade agreement of any sort. They're substituting for, in Asia, this Indo-Pacific economic framework, which is really not about market access. And there's no discussion about anything like that with Europe, not even with Britain, really, which had been a conversation talker after Brexit. So we have gone from, in just 8 years, we have gone from a more or less bipartisan consensus in favor of free trade agreements to a bipartisan consensus that we don't like free trade agreements. And that's, that is a huge change in our economic relationship with our partners, especially in Europe, which is still to this day, at the core of our trading agreements. Trump afterwards, of course, is so hostile to Europe on so many issues that everybody remembers Obama much more fondly than they might have otherwise. Any disagreements they might have had under Obama, which Ben just referenced, seem minor by comparison. And I just got back from Lisbon last night. I can tell you in Europe they would much rather have Obama back than the possibility of another Trump term. But that also then raises the other point, and then I'll let it go, is that not just on trade, but on foreign policy generally, there is this fear in Europe that we're not going to stick to what we agreed to, right? But they saw what happened when Trump came in, that half of the agreements that Obama tried to put in place, that he signed with the world, were just tossed aside. Now, every president is entitled to change foreign policy, and they do. There are shifts when new presidents come in from different parties. But I don't think you've ever seen a new president come in and throw away so many different treaties in such a short amount of time, which then, of course, the lesson from the people I talked to in Lisbon the last few days take from that is, why should we even bother making any agreements now with Biden, even though we like Biden, fine, we might agree with him, because who knows who's going to be president next? If not Trump, he'll be a DeSantis or some Trump-like candidate. And that's a real question for American credibility on the world stage, both in terms of trade, but also international agreements generally.
Professor Buonanno?
Thanks, Carolyn. Okay, so when it comes to TTIP, what I'm going to say is I'm going to look at this from an EU perspective. And so I really think that there were 3 crises from the European perspective that affected TTIP and others. So my view on this is that the EU is facing a succession of crises that were much more severe in the EU than they were in the US. I mean, yesterday's plenary, the consensus seemed to be, okay, if you wait until Monday, there won't be an economy. But for Europe, it was, if you wait until Monday, there won't be a European Union. So we're talking about the entire European integration project being threatened during the Obama administration. And I really think it was for 3 reasons. One, the Great Recession, which has been discussed so many times here. So again, from the European perspective, I think TTIP was so much more important to the Europeans than it was to the Americans. And climate change also, during this time period, the EU never abandoned climate change, which I know we're going to get into, so I won't belabor it. But climate change for the Europeans was about green technologies. It was about growing Europe using green technologies for European growth. And the mantra was growth, of course, because the EU had a bind, and it was the conditions under which a member state adopts the euro. So, of course, the other crisis related to the Great Recession, which we've talked about a lot this last day, is the sovereign debt crisis and the Eurozone crisis. Now, the Eurozone crisis couldn't be more important because the crowning achievements of the EU have been the single market, the Schengen area of free movement, and then, of course, the euro. And I know Americans were very involved in helping Greece understand what Greece would look like without the euro if they had to readopt the drachma, and it came that close. So this was really important to the Europeans. The second, of course, was 9/11. The effects of the legislation or executive orders, executive actions that Bush II, to use Mr. Baker's terms, Bush I, Bush II, data privacy, and I think Dr. Dudek is going to get into data privacy a little bit, so I won't get into the weeds, but I will say even today, the US actions with regard to data privacy continue to resonate in the EU with the Artificial Intelligence Act, which is hung up in the European Parliament right now. So if you really want to get into the weeds on that one, I'm happy to help the best I can. And with 9/11 also NATO. France re-enters NATO's integrated military command during the Obama administration, and this is symbolically extremely important after de Gaulle had pulled France out of the integrated command and headquarters moved from Paris to outside of Brussels. And then finally, I just have to mention, again in terms of TTIP, this desperation for growth in the EU during the migration crisis. So the 2015 migration crisis you can't overstate the impact that had and continues to have on domestic politics in the European Union. And one more point with this third crisis, migration, is that most of the European member states, they use proportional representation electoral systems, and with a threshold of about 5%. And so between 2 and 5%, what that means is that far-right parties can get seats in their parliaments and can have an impact on policy. So far-right populism has always been more of a threat in EU member states than it is in the United States because we have a first-past-the-post system. So we can't ignore this two-level game that's going on with domestic politics and the supranational with the EU. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Professor Egan? I'll be brief. I think that the US economy was not immune to what was going on in Europe, and given the fact that Europe was going through a recession and a sovereign debt crisis, there were concerns about the election for Obama and in terms of the impact of the US trade balance with Europe. The euro fell 20%, and so that makes certain European goods more competitive on the global market. And, this low growth and volatility in Europe is a big concern to the Obama administration. So I think that we also should also be cognizant of the divisions in Europe between those that were creditor states and ended up doing well, Northern Europe, and those that were the debtor states who were going through a tremendous period of austerity, cutbacks, and tax cuts, and also basically having their budgets taken over by the IMF with US approval, and the European Central Bank and the European Commission. And so the level of sovereignty was very, very constrained. And so I think that TTIP should be put in the context of this is a way, without spending budgets, that Europe can try and have some export growth if you can liberalize. And so I would say that TTIP, which emerged in the early State of the Union in 2013 by Obama, a lot of people will turn around and say it failed. But I actually don't. Going back to Peter's comments, I don't think it failed in the sense that, yes, the US and EU did not come up with a trade agreement. What's interesting is when the US or the EU usually negotiates with a trade partner, it's much, much smaller. And these were two very large integrated economies on trade and investment. And so here, the agreement failed, and unfortunately, but the legacy of trade liberalization continued in both Europe and in the United States. Obama was able to close the free trade agreements on Panama and Korea. The Europeans were also able to close a trade agreement with Canada, Korea, and then subsequently, after the collapse of TTIP, with Vietnam, Singapore, and others. And of course, Obama with his TPP, I think used TPP also to start modernizing NAFTA and getting pressure on Mexico and Canada. So I think overall, you can turn around and say this transatlantic ambitious agreement failed, but the overall goals of trade liberalization and market access continued.
Thank you. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and ask some question about security and military operations. And again, thinking back to the Bush administration, Bush II, as Laurie so put it, many thought that the Obama administration engaged in much greater multilateralism with Europe. However, if you look at just before the 2010 EU-US summit that was to take place, the Obama administration expressed its desire for more burden sharing with Europe, and also called for reinforced cooperation with Europe on counterterrorism and security, as well as critical foreign policy issues such as Iran. And so one outcome of European-US efforts was the Joint Comprehensive Plan for Action, the JCPOA, or as most of us refer to it as, the Iran nuclear deal. And we often forget that the Europeans were also a part of that deal. How did the forging of the JCPOA and the final agreement shape US-Europe relations? And so, Ben, I'm going to start with you since you were in the room.
Yeah. No, it was a huge project with Europe. I mean, I said the biggest set of issues was actually the economic. This is right after that. The thing you have to understand about the Iran deal is it took 7 years to get the Iran deal, because there were different phases of this. We came in and we signaled we want to pursue diplomacy, and actually, to your point in the last panel, Bush II had begun to move in that direction at the end of the Bush term. So actually, Bill Burns, who's now the CIA director, was then the Undersecretary of State, was already able to be in a negotiation. That negotiation did not succeed in 2009. But the failure of that negotiation, which was because the Iranians basically didn't follow through on some commitments they made, then allowed us or compelled us to pivot to imposing sanctions on the Iranians. Those sanctions would not have worked absent pretty uniform European cooperation, as well as Russian cooperation to some extent, and Chinese. And so then a period of sanctions leads to 2013, when we get a new Iranian president, and a window reopens for diplomacy. And then there's an incredibly intense 2 years of negotiation that is exclusively in Europe. I mean, these are in Geneva and Vienna. The European negotiators, it's the P5+1, so it's the EU, Germany, France, the UK, as well as the United States, China, and Russia in this negotiation, this multifaceted and multilateral negotiation with Iran. And a couple of things are important about this. One is that the EU being at the table was a kind of new and novel approach to a security issue, right? That you have both the principal and UN Security Council members in France and the UK, but you also have Germany and the EU at the table. I think it signaled an elevation of the EU in the foreign policy and security space to have that. And the EU representatives, Cathy Ashton from the UK and then Federica Mogherini from Italy, were really important in the negotiating room. In part also because the sanctions relief that was really going to benefit the Iranians was access to European investment in European markets, right? So the U.S. was always going to maintain a lot of sanctions on Iran. So there wasn't going to be a lot of enticement from increased business activity between Iran and the United States. The carrot of the Iran deal was very much the reopening of commercial and economic relations between Europe and Iran. And there were a lot of European companies who really were eager to be a part of that. So the U.S. was kind of wielding the stick of sanctions and the risk of military action on the Iranians, and the Russians and the Chinese were kind of, well, the Chinese deferred to the Russians entirely. So then the Russians were kind of the closest Iranian partner in the negotiations. Europe played this interesting role where obviously they were closer aligned to us, but not totally, and they were also the enticement to the Iranians. And the successful completion of that project, I think, demonstrated what the U.S. and Europe could do on a multilateral basis if we cooperated in many ways over many years. Because again, there's cooperation on sanctions enforcement, then there's cooperation on diplomacy, then there's cooperation on implementation. How do you get the deal implemented? And so it felt like a very successful project of multilateral cooperation. It depended at times on Obama's personal relationships with David Cameron and Angela Merkel, and to some extent Francois Hollande. The French were usually, a bit more difficult, but that's to be expected at the negotiating table. I think the legacy, however, though tragically, in my mind, is to echo something Peter said. The withdrawal from the JCPOA was a massive blow to U.S.-Europe relations and to the credibility of the United States to keep agreements. And you saw, and even though we're talking about the Obama years, I think this is relevant, really frantic efforts by Europeans to forestall the withdrawal from the JCPOA. Emmanuel Macron, as soon as he got elected, he set to work trying to preserve the deal. I think because he recognized not only the security implications and the economic cost. It was kind of a Lucy with the football to European companies that thought, okay, now we're going to get in and start operating in Iran. But also, I think, saw that if this deal was collapsed by the United States, that the appetite in Europe to repeat that kind of multi-year complicated diplomatic agreement would diminish. Now, Peter mentioned that Joe Biden is the first president to not be pursuing a trade agreement. It is also the case, if you step back and think about it, Ukraine is its own issue, and there the Europeans obviously are deeply invested with us. But that's kind of a crisis point. We actually have no major diplomatic initiative that we're seeking to conclude in Europe. And I don't fault the Biden people for that. I think it's because they're aware that, it's hard. We can, small wins or, global minimum tax and things like that, we are pursuing, but something of a scale of the ambition of the Iran deal is hard to replicate, having put all that effort into it and then have it withdrawn by the United States. I do still think it's a model and a template for one way to do multilateral diplomacy in a kind of post-American hegemonic world, as we were talking about in the last panel.
I would just add, I think that's right. Ben's point is not to be lost, which is this is one of the rare moments when the United States and Europe really do team up in a more or less equal way in a major initiative like this, which is not the norm. It's not the norm. I did a book on James Baker, and he, when the last part of his time as Secretary of State said about the Balkans, well, let's let the Europeans take the lead there. Well, look what happened. It once again had to wait until the Americans under Clinton to take the leadership there. We've seen that time and time again. Obama, I think, felt pretty frustrated when he said, let's let the Europeans take the lead on Libya. Didn't feel that they really did. America had to step up and become the main actor. And so the JCPOA stands out in that regard as a moment when there is this sort of genuine partnership and a genuine respect. Now, I mean, John Kerry obviously is still probably more driving force than any other individual in that room, right? He's a force of nature in terms of his determination to get a deal. And we can argue about whether the deal is a good one or not. Obviously, there's a debate about that. But I think it was one of those rare moments when you did see Europe and the United States as more or less equal partners in a major diplomatic security initiative. And that's where you bring us to today with Ukraine, where they are on the same page, which people might not have expected. I don't know if you could say that's because of some of the, ground paving on the Iran deal or not, but there does not seem to be the wedge between America and Europe on Ukraine where you might have expected there to be, and where there would have been had it been Trump, honestly, there, who, of course, made his point of going after his own friends or our friends, the United States' friends in Europe. But there is this sense of, can we do this again? Is there a mood there? They tried to get Trump, as Ben said, to say, fine, okay, you don't like the JCPOA, let's find something else. Let's build on it. Let's keep it, but then do something together, hand in hand with the Iranians. Let's go after them on ballistic missiles and terrorism and try to cover the issues that were not covered by the JCPOA, and Trump didn't want to do that, or certainly didn't believe in it. So it does stand out, but it stands out partly because it is so unique.
Michelle, can I ask you? I have a different question for Laurie, so I'm going to skip over and go to Michelle.
I suppose the comment that I would say is thinking back to the start at the end of the Bush administration and some of the change in rhetoric, that how long Europe was engaged in this process. Early on, when we talked about uranium enrichment, 2002, 2003, that the one thing that to bear in mind here is when there is an EU3, the big three, France, Germany, and the UK, they had to bring the other members along with them. There were, at this point, 27 European member states. And so, from a European perspective, it was a dual-track strategy. Diplomacy on the one hand, but then willing to go along with sanctions. And I can't tell you, just as a historic note, how difficult it is to get 27 states to agree on sanctions. We've seen it currently in the Ukraine crisis and the speed and level. So going back to this period, that took some leadership and effort. And I also sort of know that, I hate to say it wasn't in the New York Times, but in the Washington Post, I know that, Phil Hammond and Steinmeier and Mogherini wrote an op-ed to try and get it passed. And they sort of also sent some signals that if this wasn't moving forward, the Europeans might not continue with sanctions. And I think, it was considered a very important foreign policy issue. Remember, the Europeans are always asked, who speaks for Europe? And at this point, this small contact group made it, with Cathy Ashton and Mogherini in the EU3, made it much more easy to deal with Europe.
Can I say, because this is a really important point, because we worked with them on those communications, and part of what we heard from Democrats on the Hill is the Europeans are really credible ambassadors up here. Europeans actually are usually reluctant to do that. We see other countries, Middle Eastern countries, Gulf countries, Israel, usually much more active on the Hill. European ambassadors from the big three were up there all the time. David Cameron was doing Sunday shows, remember? Yep. It was an interesting moment of the Europeans making their voices heard in American politics, and I think in a very constructive way, which I would like to see more of. And the other thing you said that's really important is the Ukraine sanctions are modeled on the Iran sanctions. The central bank sanction, for instance, principally. Now, Russia's such a bigger scale, but I do think the muscle memory of having done a central bank sanction already like that across was a template for the Biden people.
So I'd like to switch a little bit and talk about security questions. And Laurie, this is really a question for you because you've written on this. There were several agreements between the European Union and the United States that was related to counterterrorism. And if you could talk a little bit about what those agreements were, how did they reshape EU-US relations, and then sort of thinking about the challenges of the US negotiating with this quasi-federal entity of 27, and at the time, I think 28, because the UK was in by 2013. What was that like?
Thanks, Carolyn. Okay, well, so I'm going to approach this in sort of a broader perspective, and then if anyone wants to get into more about these particular actions by the US and counter actions by the EU, we could be. These are fairly complex decisions the US and then the EU were taking at the time. So I'm going to start by saying the Lisbon Treaty that comes into effect in 2009, December, changes everything. Because the EU had promised the Lisbon Treaty would answer the problem of who do I call when I call Europe? that's always attributed to Henry Kissinger. We don't even know if he actually said that. But it's certainly almost a meme for Europe. And so the Europeans promised that the Lisbon Treaty would solve this issue. So December 2009, the Lisbon Treaty comes into effect. Now the Lisbon Treaty creates more powers for the European Parliament. The European Parliament is a classic opportunist institution. It's always looking to increase its power. Remember, I mean, when we're comparing the US and the EU, which we often do because the US is a federal system and the EU is a quasi-federal system, we have to remember the EU is so young. The EU was founded with the EEC in 1957. So when we look at the Lisbon Treaty and all the treaties before it, we have to understand that it's an evolving federal system. At least that's how I don't view the EU as a confederal system. I view it as a federal system in the making, and that's just my own particular strange view of the EU that's very colored by my Americanism, I suppose. Now, second point, the EP is more determined than ever to exercise its new powers, and its new powers are something called co-decision, the ordinary legislative procedure in security matters, which are called justice and home affairs, or area of freedom and security in the EU. So my third point is that the EU finds the EP, the European Parliament, finds its issue in data privacy. And these data privacy issues come right out of 9/11. So the EP particularly becomes a champion of data privacy. And they do this in opposition to the PNR, the passenger name records, which starts under Bush, and years of back and forth. The European Court of Justice gets involved. The European Court of Justice puts itself in a situation where it's saying it's ruling that the Commission did not have the power to negotiate and so forth, and the European Parliament actually takes the case to the European Court of Justice against the European Commission. So there's this constant institutional battle going on in the EU that's very difficult for Americans to grasp, because Americans are told, we finally have an EU where we know who to go to, we know who to negotiate, we know who's in power. But the EP suddenly steps in and says, no. So the PNR and the SWIFT agreements, both, and SWIFT is, of course, this all comes out through exposés in national papers, including the New York Times. And what I'm going to say about this is that the US may have won the battle, but the EU won the war. And they won the war with the GDPR, that's the General Data Privacy Regulation. The EU sets standards for privacy that that eluded the US Congress. And this, I think, is very important because then it empowers and emboldens the European Parliament. Of course, the European Parliament is a co-legislator. They legislate with what's called the Council. And the Council, is one expert on the European legislative arm, has argued the Council is really the only legislative body that sits in committee. So as most of you in the audience are probably Americans, you can think of the Council as equivalent to the standing committees in the Senate. So the EP now, the Artificial Intelligence Act, which again has another act that has eluded the US Congress. Most of our artificial intelligence, it deals with military. And so Congress hasn't been able to get anywhere, but actually the EU has written legislation. It's made it through the equivalent of the Senate, the Council. It's now in the European Parliament, and I don't think it's going to be any surprise at all when I tell you the European Parliament is holding up the legislation on privacy issues, because the Council almost always favors entrepreneurship, and it looks more American in that perspective. And the European Parliament advocates for citizen privacy. Why? Because the European Parliament is the only directly elected body in the European Union. And so the European Parliament feels that it's closer to European citizens and works closely with non-governmental organizations that defend citizen privacy. So point 4, the European Parliament begins to see the House of Representatives, the U.S. House of Representatives, as a natural ally against the Commission and the Council. And post-Lisbon, the EU begins to take on a more separation of powers look to it. So rather than the more fused systems in European national governments, the EU, because of what happens with Lisbon and the data privacy is where it's all being tested. It just happens that data privacy is where the EPP is going to be able to make this stand, and it's able because of the Lisbon Treaty changes. So they begin to project this power through alliances with Congress. So we see the liaison office becoming stronger, better funded in Washington. I think a new office is just going to be opened in San Francisco pretty soon, fairly soon as well. And we see higher level, like rapporteur, who their job is to shepherd a bill through the European legislation, which are called directives and regulations. So we see this happening where the European Parliament is saying, wait a minute, we think we can do business, but we're going to do it with the House of Representatives. And finally, bringing it back to TTIP, the failure was a shock to the European Parliament. Its own demands and delaying tactics had helped bring down the agreement because it extended the time it was being negotiated. This problem with the European Union, seeing the TTP as a living agreement, whereas the Americans didn't want a regulatory structure outside because the whole problem was with standards, because tariffs are so low between the EU and the US. The only way you were going to get growth, the Europeans understood, was through harmonization of standards or mutual recognition. Well, this is tough because Americans and Europeans have very different ideas of what regulation should look like. The Europeans are more precautionary, we're more litigation, post facto, sort of, after the fact someone's harmed, we take it to court. And so I think that this experience after Lisbon, during the Obama administration, changes this nature of how EU institutions and actors within these institutions are looking at how they're going to do business with the United States. And I suppose, and I'm finishing on this point, I suppose that I'm almost informed by Anne-Marie Slaughter's work, where she argued that the new diplomats were no longer in the State Department. They're in census, they're in DHS, they're in Customs and Border Protection. And so that the State Department no longer held the monopoly, and the EU institutions understood this. So finally, among bureaucrats and MEPs, members of European parliaments, the TTIP was the last chance to agree to transatlantic standards to thwart Chinese standard making. And it failed. And so the European Parliament, but along now with its partners, the Council and Commission, because they're the ones who make legislation, the directives and regulations, the European Commission writes the legislation, and the European Parliament and Council pass it. So I think that they agreed that they were going to be the global standards makers, and they were going to make those global standards. They achieved it in data privacy, and they were going to do it with the Green Deal, and they're going to do this in artificial intelligence. So I think during the Obama administration, the TTIP experience, coupled with the holdover from 9/11, actually taught the European Union that we're going to go it alone in standards, regulatory standards, and we're going to try to set the standards because the US seems incapable of doing that. And maybe that's a somewhat controversial analysis, but there we go.
Well, the EU are the leaders in regulations. There's no doubt that they are leading the way in certain areas, and I think these examples are sort of the beginning of that. I would like to shift gears because we don't have a lot of time, and I really want to ask the question to both Peter and to Ben. Russia. Russia invades Crimea in 2014. And today, obviously, it's really important to reevaluate the invasion and both the U.S. and the European responses to that invasion. And of course, hindsight is 2020. If you could just elucidate a little bit, what was the Obama administration's response, and how might you analyze it today with today's lens of now the broader war in Ukraine?
Sure. The way this crisis began was much more episodic and events-driven than what we saw in February 22nd, where you had this methodical build-up of the Russian forces and then a full-scale invasion. Because essentially what you have is, for the first, several years of the Obama administration, Ukraine is governed by Viktor Yanukovych, who is essentially a Putin-friendly kleptocrat. This guy has exotic animals and golden toilets and classic cars, and let's just say he didn't earn that money. But what that meant is that in 2008, a NATO membership action plan had been offered to Ukraine, very controversially to most Europeans, who did not support NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia. But that was not an issue, actually, for the first several years, because Ukraine wasn't seeking to join NATO under Yanukovych. Now, what Yanukovych was negotiating was an association agreement with the European Union, which was essentially the beginnings of a deeper trade relationship. And at the last minute, in late 2013, Yanukovych totally flips conspicuously after a visit with Putin, and cancels the association agreement and then forms a new agreement to get closer to Russia. That leads to a mass uprising in Kyiv, principally, in the central square of Kyiv, Maidan, what the Ukrainians now call the Revolution of Dignity, which is essentially a protest on behalf of being closer to Europe, but it's also against corruption and Russian influence and the dysfunction of Ukrainian politics. The US kind of gets involved with Europe, and we, together with the EU and the Russians, agree on this plan where Yanukovych holds elections early, and it's meant to be a pathway out of a political crisis. However, before that is implemented, Yanukovych flees Ukraine, goes to Russia, embarrassing Putin, who's hosting the Olympics at the time, and around that time. And then, in response, Putin moves into Crimea. He doesn't do it with a full-scale military invasion, though he does it with what were called little green men, which I always thought was kind of a evocative but strange term. But these are essentially Russian special forces are moving in, and they're seizing key infrastructure. And within hours, maybe days, Crimea is de facto occupied by Russia. And there's, by the way, also not military resistance in Crimea from the Ukrainians either. So Crimea goes very quickly to Russia. The Obama administration begins to build a response of sanctions on Russia and support for the Ukrainian government. At the same time, Putin, emboldened, kind of repeats this play in eastern Ukraine, where they're basically creating proxy forces through so-called Russian-backed separatists, but it's Russian military equipment flowing in, Russian advisors. And the war really begins in eastern Ukraine more than, Crimea, there wasn't fighting. In eastern Ukraine, the Ukrainians start resisting. In terms of our response, we were not going to go to war in Ukraine in the same way that Joe Biden doesn't want to go to war directly with Russia. And so therefore, our tools are imposing a cost on Putin and trying to support the Ukrainians. And the Europeans were pretty fractured on these issues. So in terms of sanctions, we had to work really hard to bring along Europe to impose what at the time were obviously the farthest reaching sanctions that have been imposed on Russia. In hindsight, they look very small compared to the sanctions that are now imposed. But getting Europe and getting consensus among the 27 to do what we did in 2014 and 15 in terms of sanctions was one of the most difficult things that we did in the Obama administration. So this was the art of the possible, and it wasn't lack of effort. But those sanctions had an impact on the Russian economy, but they obviously didn't have an impact on Putin insofar as he wasn't going to withdraw from eastern Ukraine. At the same time, we begin to train the Ukrainian military. This is an important point. The Ukrainian military was not what it is today in 2014. It mirrored the Ukrainian state. It had a lot of corruption. It lacked professionalization. It lacked chain of command. And so getting a NATO training mission set up to begin to organize, essentially, the Ukrainian military was a pretty big piece of business. And again, one where there was some discomfort in NATO in doing this. A lot of European countries had deep economic ties into Russia. They did not see Crimea. There was some sympathy for the Russian view that Crimea was different than the rest of Ukraine. I don't share that, but this was a view you heard in parts of Europe. And they didn't see the Donbass in the same way that they obviously saw the invasion of Kyiv. So the decision points for Obama became, after training, do we arm them? And Obama took a pretty limited approach to that. He provided a lot of equipment to the Ukrainians and a lot of non-lethal assistance, but we didn't start the kind of spigot of arms that we've seen under, obviously, in the last year, where there's been a flood of U.S. weapons going in. And then there was a negotiated agreement in Minsk between the Europeans and the Russians and the Ukrainians, but the U.S. is basically playing a role too, that kind of freezes the conflict. It doesn't end all the fighting in eastern Ukraine, but it comes up with a formula of autonomy for some of these regions without them being a part of Russia. And the European goal was to just stop the war where it was and to have a formula to try to resolve this over time diplomatically. That's the history. I think when I look in hindsight, when I hear, Obama, lost Crimea, or you should have stopped him from taking Crimea, there was no way to do that. I mean, absent the U.S., militarily defending Crimea, even if we had done the bigger sanctions, I think everything we've seen about Putin suggests that sanctions alone weren't going to cause him to withdraw from Crimea. I was on endless phone calls with Putin, not me, Obama, but I would listen to them. He had deeply internalized the view that the U.S. was behind the ouster of Yanukovych. I think he believes it. I think he genuinely believes that the U.S. was behind that. We weren't. But he equated kind of democracy funding, through like the National Endowment for Democracy and for Ukrainian civil society. Those were some of the people that were in the Maidan, and so he drew that connection all the way to a coup. What we could have done is provide more weapons to the Ukrainians. At the time, I was supportive of that. To be fair to Obama, I don't know that additional anti-tank weapons would have caused Russia to leave Ukraine, though. We have to wrestle with the reality that the Biden response, which I think has been tremendous, has not stopped Russia from gaining more territory since February 22nd. So this is not a simple formula of like we ship arms and Russia leaves. It's a difficult situation when you have a leader like Putin willing to do things like this. But if I were to I think if there's retrospective fault to be found, it's just not providing more arms to the Ukrainians. The sanctions, I really just don't know that it would have been possible to get the Europeans to do anywhere near the kinds of things that they were willing to do after February 22nd. And I think some of that should be credited to Biden, but I think the real reason for that is the scale of the invasion and the horror of the indiscriminate bombing and the vision of a European capital essentially being attacked for the first time like that since maybe the Balkans, but more echoes of World War II. So that's how I'd frame it, but Peter, I'm sure, has thoughts.
No, I think
and you feel free to ask me questions.
Yeah, I actually do want to ask you a question, because I think Ben accurately sums up the lead up to where we are today on Ukraine. I would go back a little further, though. My question to you is like, in hindsight, and hindsight is perfect, but what you should remember, what you in the audience and we should all remember, of course, is that what Putin had done was first I'm going to take the first as being Georgia in 2008, start our timeline there just for the sake of this conversation. Bush reacts and pushes him out and helps push him out along with the French and everything. But basically, that's it. There's no punishment to Putin for...
Well, it doesn't push him out of South Ossetia.
Doesn't put him out of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, absolutely right.
Yeah.
But prevents him taking... Let's put it that way,
yeah.
okay? The American and European resolve fitful as it is and dyspeptic as it was, basically it preserves Georgia in its autonomy, but not the two separatist nations or republics that Russia basically takes. And then that's it. There's no punishment of any real consequence. They didn't do sanctions, even the light sanctions, as we talked about, or maybe light's not the right word, modest or restrained or whatever, limited sanctions that were done later. He didn't even do that. Now, what the Bush people say is, look, the world was coming to a collapse on the financial crisis. We had more important things to be worrying about than punishing Russia at that time. Okay. Obama comes in, same situation. He's got a world economic crisis to be concerned about. But he decides he's going to try a reset. His view is, okay, look, we've got a new guy, Medvedev there. He's probably not really in charge. He's probably a puppet, but let's give it a shot. Let's see if we can't find things to agree on. And they did. In fairness to Obama, they came up with the New START Treaty, which is the last arms control treaty between the two countries, and that Putin is now talking about getting out of. They came up with a northern distribution network to supply our forces in Afghanistan over Russian airspace, which wasn't happening before. They had the JCPOA, which was an important thing to get Russia involved in. Otherwise, it wouldn't have succeeded to the extent that it did. But then, of course, the question becomes, does Putin take a lesson from this? And does he take a lesson from 2014 that, yeah, okay, they're going to be unhappy with me if I decide to use force in what he considers to be his space. The Russians call it the inner space, which is the former Soviet territory, where they believe they have the right to take action without external interference. The question I think now we have to ask ourselves is, did we, the United States, unintentionally send a message that there wasn't going to be any cost that then encouraged them in 2022 to say, I can do this and we probably won't have to endure that much. They'll sanction me a little bit. I don't give a crap. My people, if they lose their economic livelihood, that doesn't really matter to Putin. Did we send a signal that encouraged him, or was it always going to be this way and it really didn't matter, and the reset was a worthy experiment to take, even if it didn't necessarily last?
I guess what I'd say is the reset, as you said, was predicated on the fact that Medvedev was in, and let's see what we can do with this guy. And we did a lot. In addition to what you said, Iran sanctions were made possible because of the reset in a lot of ways. Russia acceded to the WTO. We were making domestic reforms. And there was a brief moment where we had indication that Medvedev wanted to actually see if he could hold that office. Now Putin put an end to that pretty quickly. But in a way, we wanted to empower this guy who was moving in a more Western-oriented direction. And I think that's the logic of foreign policy. You try to get things done when you have a window that opens up to do things, And if I were to find kind of fault with us, it was more when Putin came back to power in 2012, he came back with a much bigger chip on his shoulder. He was politically weaker than he had been. Those elections, the parliamentary elections that led to his return to the presidency, were pretty contested. There were large protests. The oil prices were not replenishing their coffers in the same way that they had in the 2000s. And so lacking swelling oil prices and having basically also spent too much money on corruption, right? He turned towards a pretty ugly nationalism right away. And so to me, the reset makes sense even in hindsight. It's that period in 2012, 2013, when I think about, were there some more fortifications that we could have done to kind of take into account that this guy is moving in a really dark direction, And what would those have been? I don't know. Basically, in the NATO context, for instance, maybe some of the NATO Eastern reassurance that we did after Crimea, you could have tried to pursue that earlier. Putin would have hated it, And so you're constantly, what are you going to do that's going to provoke this guy and precipitate an action versus what are you going to do to try and raise the cost? And that's always the challenge with Putin, is weighing that. I do think, though, that, even today, even with all the costs he's paid, he's all in on this war, and he's more entrenched than he's ever been. And so it's not like even the costs he's faced, 150,000 casualties, real economic damage from sanctions, has not caused him to reverse course either, And so I think I'm too close to this, people should scrutinize. There are sometimes in history when there are people that are sociopathic dictators that do terrible things, that there's not necessarily a formula that's going to prevent them from doing that. But I think people need to look at this whole 20-year arc of Putin from 2000, and you were there for some of those early years, and question this. But to me, that's it's that time frame that I feel is, what could have been done to adjust. I mean, the reset ended when Putin came back, essentially, and we canceled the summit that Obama had scheduled in Moscow. Maybe that was a mistake. Maybe actually we should have been talking to him more. You could argue it the other direction too. But we definitely did not find the formula to deal with Putin between his return and the annexation of Crimea. But I also don't know that there was a formula that might have stopped him. The one thing I'd say about Europe, and you guys may want to jump in, is there was also this kind of comfort with the frozen conflict. There's Transnistria and Moldova, there's South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia, there's the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, where Russia plays a role. I think Europeans were kind of conditioned to see as a reality, okay, Luhansk and Donetsk, this is terrible what's happening there, but it looks very familiar to us. And this is an important point that I don't see made a lot. This, it explains, I think, the severity of the European reaction this time versus that time. Luhansk and Donetsk, to them, looked a lot like all those other frozen conflicts, and nobody likes it, but it is kind of part of the post-Cold War realities, and we'll just try to keep a lid on this stuff, and we'll manage it. And they just did not see the 2014-15 dynamic anywhere near what they saw, obviously, after February 22nd. And I think that does explain some of the European view, that this was not new to them. Precisely because it had happened before, it felt like something that was part of the European security landscape, as strange as that sounds.
Michelle, did you want to comment on that?
No, the only comment I really wanted to pick up on the final comment. On the one hand, we sort of talked about transatlantic relations oftentimes as the US and EU. But I think in terms of, thinking about this in terms of Obama's interactions and the caution that Angela Merkel had vis-a-vis some foreign policy actions is very, very important. And I also think that how Europeans fell vis-a-vis Russia. I mean, you have Hungary and Poland for a period of time being quite pro-Russian. And then, so Europe didn't have
4 years when
speak
America
with a
was
single-
pro-Russia too,
Yes.
just not that long ago.
Oh, yes. And Europe didn't speak with a single voice. And I think they then, their circumstances are that their economic relationship with Russia was quite significant. And then, of course, the issue of energy, and then, closing of nuclear, which was one of Germany's issues. And so some of these issues were about not just transatlantic for US-EU, but I also think Obama would also engage with bilaterally, particularly with Germany. I'm just assuming that's the case.
Yeah, no, who do you call when you call Europe for Obama was Angela Merkel. And again, I think there were huge successes in that relationship in preserving the European project and weathering a lot of crises. I think people should scrutinize, could we or should we have done more to press her to diminish that energy relationship? We opposed the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, but we didn't go to the mat on it, So if you're talking about an area where something maybe we should have done when Putin returned to power is to go to the Germans and be like, this guy is a different iteration of himself from when you were dealing with him and things weren't that bad a few years ago. You really need to rethink this energy relationship, Again, we were actually saying that, but we weren't, really pushing. And in part because we had such respect for Merkel as this centering force in Europe, and I'm interested to see what she says about this issue as she, writes her memoir.
Laurie, you had a comment?
Thanks, Carolyn. I just wanted to pick up on the Eastern Partnership Association Agreement and connect it back to the Great Recession, because the EU is not a social project. It's a liberal project. It is driven by capitalism. And Ukraine food security has always been first and foremost to the EU. The common agricultural policy is one of the most successful policies born out of starvation after World War II. So Ukraine is a natural. It's rich in agriculture, educated workforce. Visa liberalization was going to bring cheap labor that was European into Europe, and it was going to open up Ukraine for multinational corporations. So I think that the EU, its liberal project, created a security problem but the liberal project always has trumped everything else for the Europeans who are driving the integration project.
That's exactly right, yeah. And that was the prism they continue to look at. Their answer, once the sanctions are in place, their policy priority was, how soon can we get rid of these sanctions? Not like, how soon can we get Russia out of eastern Ukraine? And that was very evident. But you guys are exactly right in both the liberal project trumping the security project, but also this point of when we had to coordinate those sanctions and coordinate that response, that's actually when the who do you call thing really came into play. Because what it became was, there's no one to call. And then it became a division of labor. We'll try to deliver the Southern and Eastern Europeans for sanctions. If you, Merkel, can work on with Cameron on it was just a total mess of actually trying to get 27 countries to do something that most of them didn't want to do. And I think Putin understood that, and I think he understood that was an asset for him. What is an interesting question is why he stopped and did the Minsk agreement. Because in retrospect, he could have gone to Kyiv in 2014. The Ukrainians were not ready to defend themselves. It was the 7 years of training from NATO and then equipping from NATO, even before what Biden provided after February 22nd. That's a very interesting, no one will know except Putin. If his ultimate intention was to swallow up Ukraine, why didn't he do that when he had some momentum in 2014? And maybe we did make him stop and think twice, but maybe we did. Maybe actually what seemed like a small response was enough to at least have him stop in Luhansk and Donetsk. It's interesting to me that I can see why he didn't do it in the Trump years, because he thought he might achieve his objectives politically. Like if Trump pulls out of NATO, then he just walks into Kyiv, right? But it's a very interesting question. Why didn't he do what he did in February 22nd in 2014? And I'm not saying that to give us credit. I'm saying I genuinely, because our assessment at the time was he might make a run on Kyiv. And the Ukrainians were nowhere near prepared to deal with it in the same way that they were last year.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this insight and insider view of the Obama administration. I want to leave a little bit of time for questions. So if anyone has a questions, there are 2 microphones.
Awesome discussion. So I know we were focusing on the transatlantic relations and economic policies, but it seemed to have implications on national security. And with respect to sort of the last hypothesis by Rhodes, why did Putin stop? And with some of the points by Dr. Buonanno, I hope I pronounced it correctly, about the liberal project. It seems that many of the interactions internationally have been liberal projects, which seems to be, antithetical to Russia's sort of political paradigm. And I wonder if you would see Putin's response or Putin's action in Crimea as being a response to the liberal projects, of course, but also to the political growth of liberal and democracy, which is further antithetical to its economics and international influence. And so, and I'm just throwing out some things out here just for you to, as experts on this, to help me out. I mean, what do you think about this narrative? Putin went as far as he could in Crimea to maybe bully President Barack Obama, but didn't go further to prevent a narrative against him that might bolster his predecessor or his successor. Yeah. Maybe anticipating that Trump might win, so don't go too far to arouse national antipathy towards Russia. And given the sort of insightful analysis that you gave of these international projects Obama had, on the surface they looked like they failed, but they were actually creating new paradigms and ways for other nations to interact in liberal politics and liberal economics. The success of Obama's actions, even though on the surface in terms of his intention to get certain things passed and get certain agreements, united, there's a shadow over Putin, which now gets him to further take action in Ukraine.
I was on the liberalism part. Yes, Putin sees himself as the opponent of the liberal project. No question about it. He sees that as a threat. No question he sees that as a useful enemy. I remember it wasn't that long ago, he gave an interview to one of the Western press in which he talked about the death of Western liberalism. And I actually was with Trump at the time in Osaka, Japan for a G20, and I asked him at a press conference, "Sir, what do you think about Putin comment about the death of Western liberalism?" And Trump didn't get the question. He started talking about California and Oregon and stuff. But
really?
No, I swear to God. And but this is exactly right. And Putin has set himself up. Ironically, right, in the old days, the Soviet days, they were far left, right? The communist project was far left. Putin sets himself up on the far right as a defender of traditional civilization against the hordes of gays getting married and transgender people having rights and all of that, and how the degradation of the West has brought down civilization. He is the champion against that, which is why there's some odd appeal, strangely, in the American right now, which of course historically has not been seen as pro-Russian. To the extent you mentioned about Trump, waiting for Trump, I don't think in 2014 he was waiting for Trump. I think at that point nobody, even in Russia, would have thought that was a likely outcome. I think Ben raises a good question. I don't know why he stopped. It's possible he did think that the sanctions were taking a little bit more of a bite. Maybe some of the oligarchs around him gave him a lot of grief about their lost money or something like that, or maybe he just thought he got enough, or maybe he just didn't get the response he thought he was going to get in Ukraine, which I think is part of it.
Yeah.
He thought he would be welcomed, we've heard this before, with flour and candy, and he wasn't. And the slog in eastern Ukraine was much harder than I think he imagined it was, and so maybe he thought he needed time to develop a better military plan. Of course, obviously it didn't work, because the military plan that he ultimately put in place was a failure, at least by the goals that he himself set in 2022. It may ultimately still, we don't know what the outcome's going to be, but it was not what he thought it was going to be.
This is the question, and I'm going to try to tie this all together, because I also think that the financial crisis, the austerity, the economic hardships in some of these countries, even before the migration crisis, right? Because you saw building illiberal politics in parts of Europe. You started to see far-right movements. You could see a guy like Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, stand up in 2014 before the annexation of Crimea and say, the future belongs to illiberal democracy. So there was this kind of normalization, but it was still pretty nascent. It was still pretty evolving around the time of the annexation of Crimea. I think it may be that, fast forward to 2022, that trend is much more above the surface globally. The Chinese are stronger, and the Russians feel like the Chinese are in their corner. And he just may have felt like, the U.S. is even weaker and more divided than it was. We see the rise of these illiberal movements, and therefore this is more moment. I also think critically, though, and it's why what I said earlier about Putin believing, I think he believes these things. Because sometimes I think we look at him and we're like, well, this guy's crazy, or, I actually think that he believes, and he's not right. So sometimes when you say this, or Mearsheimer says this, it's like, it's to justify Putin. This is not to justify, but it's just to understand that by 2022, he's older, he's been a dictator for even longer, he's been isolated through COVID, and he's just a little crazier than he was in 2014, to try to answer my own question. And he really does believe that he's in this battle, that Russia represents the kind of the soul of how Europe should be, and liberal democracy is a poison. And while he's alive, he's going to strike big blows against it, I think that that's what this is all about. And I think part of what was missing in the liberal project in Europe in 2014 was the liberal values, not just liberal economics, Obama used to give these speeches after the war started about liberal values in the European project. And I remember Angela Merkel saying to him, this is great, can you keep giving these speeches around Europe? And he said, well, it'd be great if some European leaders would also give these speeches around Europe. She had a very good comeback, which was, you don't want a charismatic German chancellor, Barack. But I think you saw what was so heartening to me after February 22nd, the invasion of Ukraine, was the liberalism became about the values again, and everybody and that was from the publics as much as the leaders. But I think this is the core point. He really does feel like he's at war with liberalism.
Thank you.
So,
Please.
so a few kind of disparate parts and questions that kind of come together. First, just in 2014, one note in terms of Russia, you had the collapse of global oil prices, fell by somewhere in the neighborhood of about 50%, down to around $50 a barrel, and that continued into 2015, down to the $40 level, and even lower to the 20 level. Peter, one of your colleagues, Tom Friedman, had noted this in one of his books, how the price of oil had historically constrained bad actors, notably players like Russia and Iran. And that's one of the things. So within that formula here, a question for Ben. When you mention the assessment of Putin, I ask, where is the CIA in this? Not so much as an espionage agency, but as an actual intelligent assessment agency that the U.S., the president, is able to draw upon for resources. Second, in terms of the JCPOA, is it possible as well that the administration missed the Iranian philosophy, posturing, if you will, similar to Putin as their own revolutionary sort of government, where their worldview is such that they see the U.S. as an interloper, their view towards gaining nuclear weapons is critical in that aspect. And then third, the JCPOA, you mentioned the 7-year negotiations between the U.S. and the EU. Had that created a emotional sunk cost to pushing the JCPOA over the finish line, rather than looking at the risks created by the situation and against the Iranian internal viewpoint from its own domestic government and diplomatic and military standpoint? A lot to chew on, I know. I'm sorry.
So on the JCPOA, I'll be much more, I just think that worked. I think no policy has been more validated by its absence than the Iran nuclear deal. The Iranians, they were implementing the deal. There was almost this comic Washington drama. Remember when Trump was trying to get his own administration to decertify Iranian compliance? They were looking for everything. They were looking, I guarantee you, that Mike Pompeo, CIA director, is looking under every rock to find proof of Iranian cheating, and they literally couldn't do it. And up until when Trump pulled out, he couldn't say, and he wanted to. The reason it delayed 6 months pulling out is he wanted to be able to say the Iranians weren't complying, and they were. They just were. And I think that we talked about this a lot. I think the Iranian system is more complex than we see it from the outside. They are able to compartmentalize. The revolutionary ideology. This is why we didn't bring, say, their support for proxy groups around the region into the negotiation, because that we did see is fundamental to their revolutionary vision of themselves. And we didn't think that the acquisition of a nuclear weapon was in the same category, because they were willing to trade that away for something in a way that they were not willing to even discuss some of these other things. Now, the Russian mindset is an interesting question, because you're right. This is not a fault of the intelligence community, because it's a fault for all of us who are in the government, but we would analyze very carefully like Russian actions and Russian behaviors, but the psychology of Putin, I think we assign often with foreign leaders sometimes, like, what would we do if we were them? And that can be useful to an extent, but that tends to not account for the variables of human beings and deeply flawed human beings. And I think that that we continued up until even February 22nd, by the way, up until we continue to be surprised by Putin, when there's a pretty long evidence trail of what kind of person he is. And if I were to connect this to a policy point of something where I want to be more self-critical, I'm very confident in my defense of the JCPOA. Another thing I think we could have done on Russia, and that we could have done more to work with the EU on, was combating the kleptocracy of it all. You know, basically Putin was using the Western financial system to hide his money, to list completely bogus companies on the London Stock Exchange that then, are like extracting mines in Africa with child labor, to have I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but the point is that we did have some tools. If you assess that Putin is basically a ideological sociopath who depends on kleptocracy as kind of the blood that the machine operates on. There's so much focus on sanctions, and that's a part of it. But a lot of it is also just getting our house in order, right? We're in New York. Like, I can tell you that there are not a lot of people living in some of those high-rise buildings that were going up for years in the boom years of Bloomberg. There are a lot of Russian oligarchs that were just stashing money there. Everybody knows it. Did we really try to stop it? And so to me, I actually think that an underutilized, for all the focus on sanctions, it's one thing to get people like designate someone. It's another thing to tell the UK, you're gonna have to take a hit to your economy and get this Russian money out. Yes. That might have made a difference, right? I don't know that would have stopped the war in Ukraine. I don't want to, again, like I said, if the guy's a sociopath with nuclear weapons, he may just do something. But I mean, I hear and there's shame on all of us that we're aware that there's all these cracks in the globalization economy that we had created with Europe, that then all these people are, all these oligarchs are taking advantage of. And I hope that we patch those things. They're beginning to, but just walk through Mayfair in London and look around. It's not British people that are buying those houses.
Thank you. This has been just such an interesting, intellectually stimulating conversation, and maybe we can continue it over lunch or at other points in time. I want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise. Really appreciate it. And thank all of you in the audience. Thank you very much.